Burkina Faso trembled on the edge of collapse. The markets had already begun to lose confidence. The bonds issued to international lenders had plummeted in value. And once, proud economists whispered of default with a mix of shame and helplessness. Crops had withered under the weight of the worst drought in decades, and with them, the livelihoods of millions. Export revenues had fallen to their lowest levels in a generation. At rural clinics, medicine cabinets sat empty. Nurses tore gauze in half to make supplies last longer. Schools had shuttered, first in the countryside, then in the towns. In Ouagadougou, unpaid civil servants lined up at banks with hollow stares, hoping for salaries that would never arrive. And through it all, the central bank's reserves were vanishing, a hemorrhage no policy could stop. It was March 2023 and Burkina Faso had only weeks left. On a cloudless Thursday morning, as golden sun rays lit the aging Phase 8 of the presidential palace, a motorcade of sleek black sedans rolled through the iron gates. The World Bank delegation had arrived. Their polished leather briefcases gleamed under the Burkinabe sun, and their tailored suits whispered power. No media had been invited. There were no speeches. This was not a public display of partnership. It was a rescue mission wrapped in silence. Inside the crisis room, the air was thick with the sour scent of exhaustion, fear, and a desperation so sharp it was almost physical. President Ibrahim Traoré sat at the head of the table, motionless, watching his ministers assemble. He had not slept the night before. He had barely spoken all week. His eyes, once sharp with revolutionary fire, were now clouded, not with age, but with the terrible weight of choices that held no victory. Around him, his cabinet filed in, their faces drawn and gray. The finance minister, Salif Ouedraogo, placed a thick stack of documents on the table. His fingers trembled slightly. His hair, once meticulously groomed, had grayed rapidly in recent months. "Mr. President," he began, his voice hoarse. "The terms, they're better than anything we've ever seen. $15 billion. Immediate disbursement, 2% interest, 20-year repayment, no political strings." He paused. "This will save us." The other ministers leaned forward. Health Minister Aminata Compaoré slid a dossier across the table, a grim compilation of photographs, charts, and pleas. Pages showed wards filled with malnourished children lying on bare mattresses, syringe drawers empty, doctors leaving the country en masse. At the back of the folder was a letter from the National Medical Union, warning of a total system shutdown. Education Minister Idrissa Kabore brought a bundle of handwritten notes from schoolteachers in rural provinces. Pages stained with dust, desperation, and fading ink. "We're on the brink of losing an entire generation," he said, voice cracking. "No teachers, no books, no food programs. In the north, children are being recruited by armed groups because the schools are closed." The infrastructure minister, Mahamadou Sawadogo, added his own contribution. Aerial photographs of flood-damaged roads, entire bridges collapsed into rivers, villages now isolated for months with no access to markets or medicine. "We are not governing a country anymore," he said quietly. "We're managing a slow disintegration." They all turned to Traoré. The room was silent for a long moment, and then, one by one, they began to kneel. Compaoré was first, a woman known for her iron will and blunt tongue. She lowered herself onto the polished stone floor, tears welling in her eyes. "Sir, children are dying," she said. "This money will buy oxygen machines. It will keep babies alive. It will pay nurses. It's not a bailout. It's a lifeline." Kabore joined her. His knees creaked audibly as he descended, gripping the table for balance. "What cannot hold out?" he whispered. "My teachers are starving. We've already lost control of half our school system." Then came Ouedraogo, the proud general turned defense minister. He knelt with his hands resting on his thighs, eyes cast downward. "Or Mr. President," he said, his voice low, "our soldiers haven't been paid in 4 months. Morale is collapsing. I fear mutiny. We cannot defend the Republic if we cannot feed the army." Their voices echoed in the vast echo-prone room, their bodies casting shadows that trembled with each breath. And yet Traoré remained still, his hands folded beneath his chin. He was not a man easily moved. He had seen war. He had led a rebellion. He had buried friends and enemies alike. But in that moment, what lay before him was something deeper than politics. A nation begging for breath. He reached slowly for the thick binder marked Emergency Economic Assistance Package, CLASFED TARS, slid it toward him, and flipped to the back. He had read hundreds of such documents before: loans, grants, partnership agreements, infrastructure MOUs. He had learned early in his presidency that the most dangerous words were not the bold promises at the top, but the fine print buried beneath. Page 739 was where his eyes caught something. A footnote. Small, easily missed. He frowned, leaned in, and read it again. It referenced a sub-clause on page 8012, which then led to an annex marked as non-public disclosure, located in a separate digital repository. He requested the file immediately. The World Bank envoy raised an eyebrow but complied. An aide returned 10 minutes later with a secure tablet. Traoré opened the document, encrypted, stamped coincidental, and read in silence. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. His jaw tightened, his breathing slowed. A stillness came over him like the calm before a storm. It was not about the interest rates. It was not about repayment terms. It was about control. Clause 14.37 outlined the establishment of an economic advisory committee, appointed jointly by the World Bank and external consultants, with veto power over Burkina Faso's future budgets. Clause 15.9.2 empowered foreign auditors to review all state-owned enterprises and recommend efficiency adjustments, including privatizations. Clause 17.45 authorized third-party management of natural resource revenues, in the interest of repayment assurance. What the contract offered was not aid, it was sovereignty in disguise, and it had happened before in Argentina, in Ghana, in Sri Lanka. A pattern, a formula: offer salvation, demand submission. Traoré closed the tablet and looked around the room. His ministers were still kneeling, unaware that the lifeline they prayed for was also a noose. The World Bank officials had spoken with the confidence of surgeons diagnosing a clean break. Their prognosis was simple: sign today, and within hours Burkina Faso would receive $5 billion in immediate relief. The rest would follow in structured tranches, each unlocking more stability, more food, more hope. The economy, they said, would begin to breathe again within weeks. Currency confidence would return. Investors would stop fleeing. Schools and hospitals would reopen. Salaries would be paid. Calm would return. It was a seductive vision, the promise of resurrection. But Traoré wasn't seduced. His academic training in mathematics had taught him to respect elegant solutions, but also to fear the ones that came too easily. Numbers didn't lie, but people who manipulated them could make truths disappear behind beautiful graphs and impressive jargon. Has anyone, he asked quietly, almost too softly to be heard, actually read all 47 pages of this agreement? The ministers looked at one another. No one spoke. A few glanced downward, ashamed. Others tried to gauge whether this was a rhetorical question. They had read summaries, executive briefs, the overview decks prepared by World Bank consultants. They had memorized the disbursement schedule, nodded along to the risk-benefit analysis. But not one had dared to comb through the 1,000-foot crawl of legal code tucked into annexes and appendices. Not in a week like this. Not with their own ministries falling apart around them. From the floor, Defense Minister Ouedraogo cleared his throat. Sir, the core terms are clear. $15 billion, 2% interest, 20-year repayment, immediate access to capital. He hesitated. It's the most generous aid package in African history. Traoré said nothing. He waited. There are structural adjustment conditions, Ouedraogo admitted, but every development loan has those. It's standard, technical provisions, fiscal guidelines. Traoré nodded slowly. Then his voice hardened. Economic sovereignty is not a technicality. That night, while the palace lights dimmed and his ministers returned to their quarters with uneasy relief, Traoré remained awake. He requested the full digital contract, not just the visible pages, the attachments, the appendices, the non-core protocols that never made it into executive summaries. He poured himself a pot of bitter black coffee and began reading. It was nearly midnight when he reached Annex 47B. The language was cautious, sterile, bureaucratic, but beneath the jargon, its implications were surgical in scope. Should Burkina Faso default on even a single scheduled repayment, whether due to war, drought, global recession, or internal unrest, the nation would forfeit control over its core financial mechanisms. The central bank would be overseen by World Bank-appointed technical advisors. Monetary policy would shift from local economists to a foreign-led stabilization board. Tax codes could be restructured. Resource revenues, gold, cotton, rare earth metals, could be redirected into offshore custodial accounts, in the interest of debt security. By page 792, he was gripping the table. Section 12.4.7 spelled it out in brutal clarity. Burkina Faso, under the terms of the agreement, would be legally obligated to prioritize debt repayment over all other domestic obligations. That meant salaries. That meant hospitals. That meant pensions, schools, food aid, vaccine procurement, everything. The clause even included a list of non-prioritized budget categories which chillingly included healthcare, education, and public housing. Traoré rose from his chair and walked to the window, the distant city lights flickering like fireflies in the night. Was this what they had fought for? Was this the liberation they had promised the people when they took office? He had marched in the streets for freedom, watched friends fall in the name of self-rule, and here it was again, control, only now draped in economic language and framed by graphs. But the most insidious part wasn't even the loss of sovereignty. It was the permanence of it. In Annex 52C, he found it the automatic renewal clause. If Burkina Faso's growth fell below a set GDP per capita threshold, or if inflation exceeded a certain ceiling, then oversight mechanisms would automatically extend for 5 years, renewable indefinitely. The thresholds were mathematically impossible to maintain in a developing nation without total economic control, which the agreement itself would undermine. It was in every way a loop, not a bailout, an acquisition, and they had almost signed it. At dawn, Traoré ordered a classified emergency briefing. One by one, bleary-eyed ministers returned to the palace's underground conference room, unaware of what their president had uncovered while they slept. Some arrived with guarded optimism, still believing that with a few clarifications, the deal could be salvaged. Others came ashamed, still kneeling in spirit. Traoré entered last. He didn't sit. He placed a thick stack of case files on the table, labeled by country. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice calm but cold, "I want to show you what this aid package really means." He turned to the first dossier, Jamaica, 1980s. The Caribbean nation had accepted World Bank structural adjustment loans during its own financial crisis. In the following years, health spending dropped by 40%, maternal mortality rose, hospitals closed, domestic agriculture collapsed as subsidized imports flooded the market. When the Jamaican government tried to raise spending to combat poverty, it was blocked by loan conditions. Next, Ghana, 1990s. Loan disbursements tied to privatization. Public utilities sold to foreign firms. Water prices tripled. The poorest neighborhoods began relying on contaminated wells again. Debt repayment consumed more than 1/3 of the national budget. Then Bolivia, then Indonesia, then Pakistan. Each time the pattern was eerily similar. Desperate country, generous-sounding package, hidden clauses, long-term control, collapsing social infrastructure. His ministers sat in silence as the documents were passed from hand to hand. "This isn't a loan," Traoré said. "It's a takeover. And we're not the first target." Kampara's hand covered her mouth as she read. Kabore stared straight ahead, unmoving. Even Ouedraogo, who had once championed the deal, looked ashen. Traoré turned to the wall monitor. With a tap, he brought up a chart showing Burkina Faso's projected repayment schedule against commodity export estimates. The red lines were obvious. Even under optimistic scenarios, repayment would require diverting nearly 40% of the national budget by year 6. More than what the country spent on education, health, and agriculture combined. "We will be paying with blood," he said, "not money." The room remained quiet. The gravity of their mistake, the speed with which they had almost surrendered the nation, hung over them like a storm cloud. And Traoré had not even told them the worst yet. He knew from intelligence contacts in the African Union that similar packages were already being drafted for Mali, Chad, and Niger. The World Bank was not reacting to Burkina Faso's crisis. It had been preparing for it. Monitoring, modeling, waiting for the collapse that would make nations compliant. The crisis wasn't an accident. It was an opportunity, not aid, a strategy. 30 years later, Traoré said, flipping through the case file in front of him, "Jamaica still can't set its own economic policy." Silence gripped the cabinet room. "The World Bank controls their budget priorities," he continued, tapping a chart that showed how social spending in Jamaica had been frozen under the terms of extended loan agreements. Their ministries submit their fiscal plans to foreign advisors for approval. Every year, no one spoke. The next folder was labeled Argentina 2001. Traoré opened it and laid out a spread of graphs and audit records. In the early 2000s, Argentina had faced a crisis eerily similar to Burkina Faso's. Currency collapse, rising debt, and widespread unrest. They turned to the World Bank. On paper, the rescue looked sound. But when Argentina couldn't meet the aggressive repayment demands, the World Bank imposed sweeping structural changes. The peso was devalued, public jobs were slashed, unemployment soared to 25%, poverty doubled, suicide rates spiked. The room sat in stunned stillness as the images of abandoned schools and shuttered hospitals flickered across the monitor. Argentina lost a decade, Traoré said, and they never regained full control of their economy. Then came the most unsettling case file of all, Greece. Though not in Africa, its story had become a cautionary tale. Under pressure from both the EU and the World Bank, Greece had accepted bailout terms tied to austerity measures so severe that the country's entire public health system began to collapse. Clinics closed, medical supply shortages became normal, education spending was cut by nearly 40%, and sovereign control over tax collection was effectively outsourced to foreign agencies. But the most damning revelation came not from the history books, but from someone in the room. Dr. Sarah Kababor, the head of Burkina Faso's newly formed Office of Economic Intelligence, stood and connected her tablet to the main screen. Her tone was calm, almost clinical. But what she said made the air in the room vanish. "Monsieur President," she began, "my team reverse engineered the World Bank's repayment models. We ran simulations using Burkina Faso's actual fiscal data." She paused. "This loan is designed to be unpayable." Murmurs rippled through the cabinet. She tapped the screen, and a graph appeared. It showed two curves, one representing Burkina Faso's projected government revenue over 20 years, the other, its required debt service under the proposed loan. "They're asking us to commit 40% of our total revenue annually to debt repayment," she explained. "But our maximum sustainable debt service threshold is 15%. Anything above that forces cuts to core government functions." She showed the math, the deficit curve, the delayed defaults, the algorithm that practically ensured a breach within 3 years, even in best-case economic scenarios. "They know we'll default," Kababor said. "The low interest rate, 2%, is irrelevant, because once we default, the structural adjustment terms activate. The cost of that intervention far outweighs any savings from the interest." Finance Minister Ouedraogo looked at the charts. His face lost all color. "These models show default within 3 years," he said hoarsely. "No matter how fast we grow." "Exactly," Traoré replied. "This is an emergency aid. It's a precision-crafted acquisition strategy." He let that sentence linger. "They're loaning us money they know we can't repay, then taking control of the entire economy once we fail." That afternoon, just before 3:00 p.m., the World Bank delegation waited in the palace's formal reception room. Their confidence was unshaken. They had seen this scene play out many times before in Latin America, Southeast Asia, the Caribbean. Desperate leaders, a room full of suits, smiles, signatures, control. But today would be different. Traoré entered the room flanked by his senior ministers and intelligence officials. In his hands, he carried the 8047-page contract, the original unmarked, its spine now broken from repeated reading. He walked slowly to the polished negotiation table and set the thick document down with deliberate care. "Gentlemen," he said calmly, "I've read your proposal. Every page, every annex, every clause." James Morrison, the World Bank's senior envoy for Africa, leaned forward with an affable smile. "Then you understand that this represents Burkina Faso's only viable path to economic stability." Traoré returned the smile. But there was no warmth behind it. "I understand," he said, "that this document represents the most sophisticated economic colonization scheme ever devised." The room froze. No one moved. No one breathed. "You are offering us money you know we cannot repay," he continued, his voice now sharp as a blade, "with clauses engineered to seize our central bank, our tax system, and our natural resources the moment we miss a payment. You call it aid. But it's acquisition." With a 20-year timeline, Morrison's expression twitched. His mask of diplomacy faltered. But Traoré was not finished. "I will not mortgage the soul of my nation to finance short-term survival," he said. "We are not for sale." He picked up the contract and held it out. "I reject your terms. All of them." The silence was tectonic. No one had ever said no, not like this, not with this kind of clarity, not backed by math strategy, and the willingness to endure the storm. Morrison recovered slowly. "President Traoré, without this support, your economy will collapse within weeks. Civil unrest is already." Traoré raised a hand. "We will find another way." And with that, he turned and walked out, leaving the World Bank team blinking in disbelief. What followed in the weeks ahead would become the subject of economic textbooks, TED Talks, and think tank debates around the world. The decision, widely condemned by Western media at first, sparked something in other African nations. Leaders in Chad, Mali, and even Ghana began to ask new questions about the aid they were receiving. The African Union called for a full audit of structural adjustment programs continent-wide, and Traoré's speech before the Pan-African Economic Forum became a viral rallying cry. But on that day in that room, he had done something far more powerful than reject a contract. He had reclaimed his country's future. "Mr. President," Morrison said, his voice clipped now, "without this assistance, Burkina Faso faces economic collapse. Then we'll face that collapse as a sovereign nation." Traoré replied without hesitation, "Rather than surrender our independence for temporary relief." He opened the contract again, flipping deliberately to Annex 47B. Upon any payment default, he read aloud, "The recipient nation surrenders monetary policy control to World Bank-appointed advisors." He looked up slowly. "This clause alone makes us a protectorate, not a borrower." He turned to section 12.4.7. His tone sharpened as he read, "Debt service payments shall be prioritized above all domestic spending obligations, including but not limited to health care, education, and social services." He paused. "You're asking us to let our children die to pay your interest." The World Bank team shifted uncomfortably. Their silence spoke volumes as Traoré exposed clause after clause, each designed not for support but for subjugation. It wasn't just a contract. It was a control mechanism, precise, deliberate, and weaponized. The international reaction was swift. Within hours of the rejection, the story exploded across global financial news outlets. Commentators speculated. Markets trembled. The World Bank issued careful statements citing misunderstandings and mischaracterizations. But they never denied the clauses Traoré had quoted. They couldn't. More importantly, something deeper began to stir. African leaders from across the continent, Ghana, Kenya, Nigeria, Malawi, began requesting copies of Burkina Faso's analysis. What they read alarmed them. Within weeks, similar loan packages offered to their governments were halted mid-negotiation. Finance ministers demanded full audits. Parliamentary oversight bodies were activated. The African Union convened an emergency committee to review all pending international development agreements. What they found was damning. Virtually every major development loan included sovereignty-stripping clauses, disguised as technical provisions, hidden in annexes, buried in conditionality frameworks. It was not a mistake. It was a pattern. 6 months later, the transformation was undeniable. Traoré had rejected the easy path and chosen something harder. Burkina Faso implemented emergency austerity measures. Government salaries were cut across the board. Luxury imports were suspended. Non-essential projects were frozen. The pain was real, but unlike externally imposed austerity, these decisions were made by Burkinabe economists based on Burkinabe priorities. The government renegotiated existing debts, one by one, with bilateral partners willing to accept more humane terms. Then came the Build Burkina campaign, an unprecedented effort to mobilize domestic capital. Citizens were asked to invest not just money, but trust, labor, and belief. They responded, savings increased, local industries revived, agricultural cooperatives doubled their output, and something even more remarkable happened. Other African nations began coordinating. Finance ministers met weekly. Cross-border infrastructure initiatives gained momentum. Import-export tariffs were harmonized. A new vision emerged: economic independence, not isolation. It was called the Ouagadougou Principles, drawn up by economists from 8 African nations. These principles became the foundation of a new African Development Bank, one designed to provide emergency support without surrendering sovereignty. The founding charter banned conditionality clauses that infringed on core domestic policy. It was a revolution, not in arms, but in architecture. 1 year later, before a packed hall of the African Union, President Traoré stepped to the podium. "When the World Bank offered us the $15 billion, he said, they weren't offering development aid. They were offering economic slavery, with better financing terms." The applause was thunderous. It lasted 8 full minutes. True emergency aid, he continued, doesn't come with clauses designed to ensure permanent dependence. Real development assistance strengthens sovereignty. It does not hollow it out. His final words became legend. We chose temporary poverty over permanent servitude. And that choice has made us richer than any loan ever could. Today, Burkina Faso's economy is not just stable, it is thriving. Domestic investment drives the growth. Regional partnerships sustain it. A country that once stood at the edge of collapse has become the symbol of a new era in African economics. The World Bank officials who believed desperation would make Traoré sign anything learned a lesson they hadn't anticipated sometimes. The most dangerous negotiator is the one who has nothing left to lose, except his principles. And those principles proved more valuable than 15 billion.